Lindsay Sturkey, and welcome to Simple Spiritual Practices. In each episode of this podcast, we'll talk about one tangible practice that will help you know yourself and God better. Most of these practices can be done in 5 minutes or less, so you can easily try it out today. If you are ready to experience real growth in your life, or if you want fresh ideas on how to approach your time with God, this podcast is for you. I wanted to talk today just a little bit about how I choose what to talk about in each episode of this podcast. So when I approach an episode, I spend time each week thinking and praying about what I should focus on for that week because I want it to be helpful to you with really practical action steps and takeaways. I also really want to share authentically about what God is doing in my own life to kind of model what it actually looks like to incorporate spiritual practices into your everyday life. It's really important to me to share here what my own spiritual practices look like on a day-to-day basis because it has to start with me in my own life before I have anything of value to share with you. Because I really believe that this podcast really needs to be an overflow of what God is doing in me. So when I think about what to do an episode on, I'm paying attention to what I'm learning, what God's been showing me, and how some of these practices look for me these days. But lately, as I think about what I should do in each episode, I've wondered if I'm starting with the wrong question. Because a lot of times when I approach an episode, I ask myself, what spiritual practice should I talk about this week? It's a good question. It's not a bad one, but sometimes I end up feeling stuck because there are only so many spiritual practices we could talk about. Now, there are a lot of them to choose from, but there's not an infinite number. And there are a lot of practices that I've either not tried or that aren't really a part of my everyday routines right now. Now, I share all this with you not because I think you care all that much about how I plan episodes. I promise there's a point to this. But I realized that how I approach these episodes actually connects really closely to how we view our spiritual growth and the role that spiritual practices play in our growth. So here's what I mean. When I'm planning topics for episodes, by starting with the question, what practice should I talk about? Really what I'm focusing on is what we do. I'm asking, what should we do this week? But if you've been around this podcast for any amount of time at all, you know that spiritual formation is not about what we do, but it's about who we're becoming. It's a process that starts with an inner work that only God can do. And it does lead to outward change, and there's a time for action. But first, it has to be something God does in us. So our first question should not be about what practice that we do, but who we are wanting to become. What does God need to form in us? And what is God already doing in our lives that He's inviting us to pay attention to? Before we know what to do, we need to first know what needs to be formed. So that's the question that I'm asking myself these days, not only as I plan podcast episodes, but also as I consider my own path to growth. So first, what needs to be formed in me? And then comes the question, what practices will create space for God to do that? Both questions are important, but it's essential that we start with the right question. I want to give you an example of what this has looked like in my own life lately, of how to start with the right question of what needs to be formed in me instead of starting with what I need to do. So the other night, I couldn't seem to get to sleep. I was tired and it had been a long day, so there really was no reason at all for me to still be awake. But it was one of those nights where my brain decided that now would be a really good time to think about all the things I haven't gotten done yet, all the stuff on my to-do list, what I'd been putting off. And my mind also started to feel just kind of random anxiety about different things, about my kids, about the summer, all sorts of things that really were outside of my control, that my mind spinning about them wasn't going to do any good. So I wonder if you've had moments like that too. Or maybe for some of you, it's not an isolated moment, but that describes your life in general right now. Maybe you find your mind constantly drifting to anxiety, or you feel stressed over the long list of things that you need to get done. So how do we start with the right question? First, let's look at that question. If that's what's going on in my life, what might need to be formed in me? So as I think about that in that particular situation, I would say that I need peace and I need trust. Maybe God is forming patience in me as I look ahead to what's next. God might be wanting to form a posture of surrender and release in me. So another thing that's helpful about starting with this question of what is being formed in me is we're not just assuming something's wrong with us because we can't stop worrying. We don't beat ourselves up. We don't tell ourselves to just get it together or try to stuff it down or distract ourselves from it. We notice it, we face it, and we name it for what it is. We say, this is anxiety, this is fear. I'm feeling a lack of trust or surrender. And then, instead of ignoring it or trying to fix it, we focus on what is being formed in us. How is this experience an opportunity for us to grow? Then we can consider what practices will create space for that growth and transformation to take place. Now, as a reminder, we always approach this with God, asking Him to show us what it is we need to do. We're not going to rush into fixing mode or just do a practice so we feel like we're making progress. These practices are about creating space for God to do what only He can do. It's not up to us, but what we can do is show up, create space, listen, and then we move as God leads us, knowing that we will not move forward on our own. So with all that in mind, that we're not going into fix-it mode just to do something, but we are listening for what practices might help form trust and surrender in us. What would help us in this situation or something like it? What would help us release our anxiety and rest in God's presence? So one thing that helped me that night was the practice of download, a practice we've talked about on this podcast before several times. And this is where you take just a scrap piece of paper and write down whatever is on your mind. So when I did this the other night, it was mostly just a list of some things I needed to do, but just getting them out of my head and onto paper cleared some mental space. And this practice is not about journaling. It's supposed to be messy and quick. It's just getting it out of your head and putting it into tangible words. Because I found that it can help take that kind of abstract anxiety we feel and put it into a tangible form. And something about having it just written down and out of our minds makes it feel a lot more approachable. So another practice that might help create space for God to form something in me when I'm feeling anxious is a simple prayer of surrender. Maybe we say the simple prayer, God, I give everyone and everything to you. Now, that prayer comes from a practice called the 1 minute pause. We talked about that in episode 21 if you want to go back and listen to that. But that's just another example of a practice that can help form that posture of trust and surrender in us. So I did this the other night after I wrote out what was on my mind, after I got it on paper. I said a prayer of surrender, just giving it all to God. And as I prayed, I reminded myself of God's goodness and love, that I could trust Him and that I was okay because He is with me in all of that. And those two practices, they didn't take long at all, but they were simple ways for me to create space for God to form something in me. I started with the question of what is being formed in me, and then I asked what practices will create space for God to do that. I started with the being, and then I moved to the doing. As we think about our own spiritual growth and formation, let's make sure to start in the right place. Instead of asking what we should do, let's consider who we are becoming. My hope with this podcast is that I wouldn't give you a long list of new things to do, but that together we would consider, what is God forming in us? And what practices will create space for Him to do that? Some practices will be kind of consistent and constant for us, things such as silence, prayer, or reading scripture. But some practices that we do might just be for a season, because the point is not the practices themselves. The point is becoming more like Jesus, and we will become like Him by abiding with Him, surrendering our striving and opening ourselves up to the work that He wants to do in and through us. So this week, I want you to take some time to reflect on that question. What does God want to form in me right now? Maybe you just write that question down on a piece of paper and then just jot down a few ideas of what you sense that God might be showing you, of things that He wants to form in you as He transforms you into the likeness of Jesus. And then after you do that, ask God to show you if there are any specific practices to help you along in your journey towards becoming more like Jesus. And then simply begin. No pressure, no agendas or expectations, but simply creating the space for God to do what only He can do in and through you. Thanks for joining me today for this episode of Simple Spiritual Practices. If you want to download a free printable for this week's practice or find other resources to help you take next steps, visit lindsaysturkey.com/free. This podcast is part of the New Hope Podcast Network, and production is done by Darren Hansen. You can check out all the podcasts on the network by visiting newhopechurch.cc/listen. Make sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode, and we'll be back with a new episode next week.